Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Everyone experiences trauma at some point in their lives. Many of us have gone to great lengths to heal from traumatic experiences. Yet, despite our best efforts, some damage persists. What if we consider the trauma that can occur at or before birth? Do they hold the key to completing our healing journey? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the Voice of Canada Broadcast Network, www.vocbn.ca. With us this hour to explore pre-birth trauma is Cherionna Menzam-Sills. Cherionna is a somatic pre- and postnatal therapist, Continuum somatic integrative teacher, and a biodynamic craniosacral therapist with a doctorate in prenatal and birth psychology. She's the author of The Breath of Life and Spirit into Form and The Prenatal Shadow, Healing the Traumas Experienced Before and at Birth. Her website, birthingyourlife.org. Cherionna, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you. Well, it's really lovely to be here. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm really interested in your work. Everybody should contemplate what happened to us before we could remember, right?
Well, I feel that way.
What drew you to the study? What drew you to the study of pre and perinatal therapy?
Well, I feel like I was guided to it, really. So I could go back to my own history, which I didn't know about at the time that I started studying, but that's maybe for later on. What drew me directly into studying it was I was doing body work and massage at the time, and I had 2 clients, I think within a week, birth themselves off my treatment table. And there were these big guys. I'm like 5'2". I'm not tall. And these guys were at least a foot taller than me, big guys. And they knew what was happening, and I knew what was happening. We both felt like I was their midwife, and they literally were coming off the table, and somehow I knew how to support them, and they didn't crash land on their head or anything. And it felt like a beautiful birth, and they were quite transformed by the experience. So I was curious about that. And that was shortly before I was in Vancouver at the time. It was shortly before I moved to Boulder, Colorado, to study at Naropa, which is now at Naropa University, dance movement psychotherapy. And you can't, and it was actually somatic psychotherapy with a specialty in dance movement. You can't study somatic psychotherapy, which is body-based psychotherapy, without running into pre and perinatal meaning around the time of birth, without material from that time, because it's in the body and it's pre-verbal. And so that got my interest up. But as part of that course, that training, we had a course called something like Birth and Death in Body-Centered Psychotherapy. And that really did something to me. And also there was a workshop with William Emerson, who's a big pioneer in the field of pre and perinatal psychology. And somewhere in there, I thought, I just had the feeling, I need to get a Ph.D. in this. There wasn't a Ph.D. in existence at the time. I helped to create mine. But it's like I had to learn more. And something in me knew that for my own healing, I had to do that. And it seems to relate to what I'm here for.
So would you mind telling us what do you mean by birthing themselves off the table?
So, in body work, the person's lying on the table. And I don't remember exactly what was happening. I was probably holding their head or, um, near their head. And they started to move. I think they were moving into my hands, because I've had that happen many times since. So I'm guessing that's what happened back then, but it was many years ago. So I don't remember exactly the details. But what's a common way for people to experience their birth in their body is their head starts to turn and their body starts to turn, which is what happens for the baby negotiating the womb surround. And then they're pushing, babies push with their little feet, and it was like they were pushing and coming forward into my hands, and there was nowhere to go. So I gently guided them to the floor, but it felt like a birth.
So what you were working, for those of us that aren't familiar with the form, you were holding their head in your hands. How did you initiate them going back into a birth experience?
I didn't.
You're just
I
holding
was,
their head, and then all of a sudden they're doing their thing.
yeah, people do that because it's there, it's waiting to be seen, to be acknowledged. And um, it often shows up in body work. And I don't remember if I was doing craniosacral therapy with them, but yeah, I was doing some craniosacral therapy at that point, and I've since studied a lot more, and I teach that as well. And it's very common in that work, both in holding person's cranium, their head, where a lot of birth trauma tends to be stored because the head goes through a lot when, at least if we birth head first, can also be in the pelvis, or anywhere in the body, actually. But as the person's system is seeking its own healing, it knows to go to that. And it's quite
So
amazing.
would you mind explaining to our audience what is sacral cranial work? What were you doing there?
So craniosacral is what
Sorry.
people call it different things. The work that I do, we call biodynamic craniosacral therapy, or craniosacral biodynamics. And it's a particular form of craniosacral therapy. Craniosacral means cranium and sacrum, and it is a form of hands-on body work that evolved out of osteopathy. The father of cranio-osteopathy was William Sutherland, he was an osteopath, and he got curious about, he'd been taught that the bones of the cranium of the head don't move, the bones of the skull. And he started doing experiments to prove that, and found that, yes, they do move. They are movable, and that various problems can come when they're not able to move. And so cranial osteopathy developed from his beginnings, and it came into the non-osteopathic field, in part through the work of my husband, Franklyn Sills, who studied osteopathy and then did extra work with cranial work, and was encouraged to develop a curriculum for teaching non-osteopaths this work.
So Cherionna, when you were working with a person's head, then I take it you were adjusting the little bones in the head. Is that what triggered then the birth memory?
Well, back then I might have been adjusting. In biodynamic work, we actually just listen.
Okay.
And we allow the life force in the person, the health. Sutherland talked about health with a capital H, that's in all of us. We support that in coming to the foreground, and it knows what's needed. We talk about the inherent treatment plan. And it's like there's an intelligence with a capital I that knows what's needed. And so it brings that forth. And if it's a birth trauma. You might have somebody feeling like they're a baby, or, like I said, starting to move their head, or it's not that common for them to actually come off the table. But that's what happened. And it happened twice in 1 week, I think. So I was really struck by that.
So
Something's going on here.
somebody was knocking on your door.
Really?
Yes. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I understand you studied with some prenatal pioneers. Who were they and what impact did they have on your work?
Right. Well, I mentioned William R. Emerson, who's a really quite amazing man who has really been a pioneer in doing therapy with babies and very small children.
How do
And
you therapize a baby? They can't talk.
exactly. So our prenatal and birth memory doesn't talk either. It's not in words. But babies are very eager to show you what they have experienced. And so part of it is inviting that. Part of it is helping the baby to feel safe in the relationship with you. I've worked with a lot of babies through craniosacral therapy because it's so helpful for them. And often a baby will take one look at me and go, "Oh, you understand this. Here, look. Here's what my birth was like." So, it's partly just meeting them with the understanding, but being able to talk with them, recognizing that they are very present and they're responsive. And we don't know how, but they understand language. They understand when we speak to them, not just the tone of voice. So you can work with a baby to help them to know that they can say no. If they don't want you to put your hand there, they can push it away, and you teach them how to push it away. More often, babies will take your hand and go like that. I want you to put your hand there. It's really obvious. But also, babies are they're very close to their birth experience, and so they very easily express the feelings from that if there was some trauma.
So do you empath that or hear it in your mind's ear?
Hmm.
How do you receive the information?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I feel like I work very intuitively,
Mhm.
but I think we all have that ability, and it's trained out of us.
Mhm.
So, mothers who have had enough support and are really bonded with their baby, they know what their baby needs and what the baby's expressing. And what I find often is that the mother or the parents just need some support in really listening, going, "Well, what do you think the baby? What's your feeling? What the baby's expressing?" It's like, "Oh, they sound angry." Like they might not even believe the baby could be angry, but babies can be angry about what happened to them, and they want you to know that. And just reflecting it back, going, "Yeah, you're really angry," or "That was hard back then," or "That was really scary. And now you're here with mom, you're here with us, you're safe here." And then,
Well, it's time for us to take a station break. Cherionna and I will return very shortly, so don't you go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Where does it all start? Can someone be traumatized in the womb? With us this hour discussing prenatal trauma is Cherionna Menzam-Sills, the author of The Prenatal Shadow, Healing the Traumas Experienced Before and at Birth. Her website, birthingyourlife.org. Cherionna, I don't think very many of us recognize that children can be traumatized before they leave the womb. Would you mind expressing to us how that happens and what the symptoms are?
yeah, such an important question. I appreciate you asking that because many people never even think to ask that. Um, so there are many ways a baby can be traumatized in the womb. And I find myself slowing down when I talk about this, because if we've had those traumas, we might resonate with what I'm talking about and start to feel upset now. And that's not my intention. So just to remind all of us that we've all survived whatever happened back then. But I'll mention a few common ways that little ones are traumatized in the womb. So one that's very common is having lost a twin.
Mm.
So more than half of conceptions are multiple, and fewer than half of births are multiple, which means that somewhere along the way, somebody was lost.
Mm.
And that can happen, that often happens around the time of implantation, which is before usually the parents even know there's a baby there. But the surviving twin has an experience, and they know. Of course, they don't have words to talk about it, and nobody reflects it back to them, right? So they're often, they grow up, and maybe through their whole life, they're feeling grief. They don't know why, or they're kind of depressive. They don't know why, or they're really looking for someone, that special soulmate. And maybe we all have a soulmate, but it's like there's a longing to find that person that they know, and they latch on to someone really quickly in relationship and go, oh, that's not them after a while. That might resonate with you or a few listeners. It does for me. So that's an expression of their memory of that early trauma. And there are other losses that can happen along the way as well. So for example, the mother might experience a loss, like maybe a parent dies, or her partner dies, or they split up, or there's a war or some very stressful event. And so the mother, in her physiology, there's a reaction to the stress, and the chemicals of stress, the stress hormones, are transferred to the baby. And so babies who have developed in a womb of a mother who experienced extreme or chronic stress, they actually have altered levels of of cortisol, which is a stress hormone.
So they come in fight or flight.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh.
Or freeze. Very common. Babies aren't able to fight or to flee, right? So all they're able to do is to collapse and shut down.
Mm.
So very common when there has been prenatal trauma or very early trauma, is to be dissociative, to be not quite here. Yeah.
I know that another example, I think, is when the mother, say she's an unwed mother, and there's all the stress and the baby's ruining her life in her viewpoint. That can be very traumatic too, as I would expect.
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest things. We call that so there are there are developmental milestones after birth, like baby is able to sit up, and then they're able to crawl and to walk. Those are milestones. They happen before birth as well. And one of them we call discovery. So it's the time when the parents discover the pregnancy, usually that there's been a pregnancy test. So the baby at that point is completely dependent on the parents celebrating that they have a baby, and welcoming them, because that means protection, that means safety. And if there's any doubt on the part of the parents, especially the mother, that's going to affect the baby.
Mm.
There's ambivalence, which there probably usually is ambivalence. Like most pregnancies actually aren't planned. Or even if the parents are planning to have a baby, it's not when they expect it. I have met so many parents who come in with their little baby, or they found out they're pregnant. It's like, oh, I just wanted to take that trip to Nepal first, or, to finish my degree, or be in a relationship, or, have some
And
money.
I can see the baby at that point. I came all the way from the stars, and this is the greeting I get.
Right. Or
Yeah.
it could be like, whoa, who's going to take care of me?
Yeah.
What are they going to do with me? Am I going to be fed? Am I going to be,
Mhm.
is there enough for me? Is there something wrong with me that I'm being rejected? And so they
Right.
go through life often expecting to be rejected.
So that was my next question: is how does early experience, while still in the womb, before the brain develops, actually, have a profound influence on us in our adult life, and what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, that's one way. I do a lot of supervision with practitioners and new practitioners, sometimes not so new practitioners. They have to put themselves out. They have to create a website and business cards and all that. And so many of them have trouble doing it. And when we look at what their discovery was like and acknowledge that and work through that, they then become more able to put themselves out. Like they're afraid of being rejected again. So
Mm,
that's the way it manifests.
wow.
And you might wonder, how can that happen without a brain or a nervous system? Like, don't we need a brain to remember things? And the answer is no. Um, we need a brain to remember, like this conversation that involves some parts of my brain, to remember. Um, so that's verbal memory, to remember the order of events, for example. Um, but pre-verbal experience, which includes the experience before birth, is recorded in different ways. The brain
Is-
is developing in the womb, but it's the body tissues, the cells that are remembering. Yeah.
and so that explains why you can get at it when you're working through the body, is that's where the memory is held.
Yeah. I don't
Pretty
think you can
fascinating.
really, I don't think you can really work with this territory without including the body. People
I,
have tried, but I don't think it's as effective. That's just my opinion. But
I can certainly see how that would be.
mm,
So, how does a traumatic birth, say for instance, affect us later in life?
yeah, it's really interesting. And again, many births are traumatic. There's some therapists who believe that every birth is traumatic. I don't know that that has to be true. Some women have an orgasm while they're giving birth, and that I can't imagine that isn't pleasurable for the baby, you know. But all kinds of things can happen at birth. So any kind of intervention, medical intervention, even if it's life-saving, which occasionally they are, in a very small percentage, they're actually needed, um, is actually interrupting the baby's intention. It may be important that that happen, but it's going to be much less traumatizing for the baby if somebody explains that to them. Because the reason we're doing this, is to help you get out. And say it's forceps, you're going to
Mhm.
feel something a little cold on your head, but it's to help you get out, and then to do it gently and sensitively, acknowledging that this is a sensitive being, right?
Is that the first step? Is recognizing that they aren't, we see them as people once they start speaking and interacting, but they're present and recording and experiencing from the get-go, it sounds like.
Yes. Maybe even before conception, and again,
Mhm.
we don't quite understand probably how that happens, but people have memories of coming in before conception. So these are implicit memories. They're nonverbal, they're pre-verbal, and um, they can establish patterns for life. And
Mhm.
because they're, usually nobody talks about them, nobody even knows that they've happened. Nobody even acknowledges that the baby in the womb has consciousness, let alone that they could possibly be learning or remembering anything. Maybe that's changing. So maybe in the later months, people might think that's possible, but certainly not when they're a unicellular organism that's just come into life. But they are. And so, in my opinion, that experience becomes shadow material. There's a term from Carl Jung, who talked about unconscious shadow. It's like unconscious experience or material feelings beliefs, whatever, that are considered unacceptable.
Do you feel that the trauma that infants experience pre-birth and at birth cause a bit of memory loss? The more gentle and accepting the pre-birth and birth, the more likely they are to actually remember.
Well, again, I think we're talking about two different kinds of memory here.
Hmm.
So,
The reason I'm asking is a personal question. When my son was about 5 years old, he turns to me and says, "I remember picking you." And I went, "Okay." And
oh,
he
cool.
described a car that he'd never seen, that I'd never mentioned. There was no pictures of him. He described a coat that he'd never seen, and it was just about the time I met his father. And I found that a little eerie, to say the least. He was just matter of fact about it.
Yeah, it gives me chills. There are all kinds of stories like that. And to me, it reminds me of what happens with near-death experiences, where somebody supposedly is medically dead
Hmm.
for a few minutes, and when they come back, they can say what was being discussed at the end of the hall, or what color sweater somebody was wearing who they shouldn't have even known was there, you know. So there's some kind of other knowing that we seem to have before we're born or when we're little. And again, I think it's available throughout life. We learn to not pay attention to it. But
Brings up a whole question about consciousness, doesn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
trauma um, doesn't block that. It doesn't destroy that. Trauma is remembered very strongly in the body.
In the body, because people compartmentalize as adults. They'll compartmentalize trauma and maybe forget all about it,
Yes,
or children growing up. But if you're talking to the body, apparently it's a little more honest.
it's very honest if you know how to listen, right? And that just feels so important to me, to how can we develop an ability to really listen. That involves, I think, first of all, acknowledging there's a possibility that the little one in the womb actually is having an experience. Otherwise we won't want to know about the experience, right?
Exactly. It's pretty fascinating. So it makes a lot of sense singing to them and reading them stories before they're born.
Yeah, and
It's
they'll
it,
recognize the story afterwards and prefer it
amazing.
as soon
Well,
as they're
it's
born.
it's that time for us to take another station break. Cherionna and I will be right back to continue our discussion. Please stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. How can an innocent baby have a shadow? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing the shadow is Cherionna Menzam-Sills. Her website, birthingyourlife.org. Cherionna, you started talking a little bit about shadow in the last segment, and I'd like to go into that a little bit. How can babies have shadows, and what is this shadow?
Mm. Well, I think we all have shadow material, which means that it's aspects of ourselves that have not been accepted, or that we feel have not been accepted. And so in order to be accepted and survive in our families usually and in our societies, we push them down into our unconscious. So the way I see it, babies have experience all the time, as we've been discussing, and it it isn't supported in coming into consciousness. So if you think about, if a little toddler is taken to the zoo, mom takes their toddler to the zoo, and the next day the toddler draws a picture of a giraffe and shows it to mom. And mom says, "Oh, that's the giraffe we saw yesterday at the zoo with its long neck. Remember, we also saw the elephants with their big ears." Right? So she's reflecting the experience, bringing it into words. This toddler who's developing language is learning what the language is for what they saw, what they experienced, and what they drew. But if they draw a picture of what happened to them in the womb, usually mom doesn't know what that is. She may or may not be interested. I think times are changing and moms probably listen more or try to. But, if there's no context for understanding it, mom isn't going to understand it, right? And if she has her own trauma, which she hasn't worked through, it might be too uncomfortable for her to understand it. So that doesn't happen. What happens instead is, "Oh, what a pretty picture. Let's go play with this." Or, she might ask the child what it's about, but they might not have the words for it because nobody's given them those words yet. So as they're developing language and they're developing a conscious mind, and those parts of the brain that are involved in conscious memory and verbal memory, those aspects of their experience aren't being reflected and put into words. So the child learns that they're not acceptable and they get pushed into the unconscious. So they become shadow. What that means is that they get acted out all the time. Shadow wants us to shine the light on it. Shadow wants to be seen. I always think of it as being like, if you have a long lost child that, has been in a cupboard, this might be traumatizing to describe, but they've been, somewhere hidden away for a long time, and you open up the door, it's like they want you to see their feelings, how they feel about it, right? And hopefully they're being welcomed at that point.
So if they're developing, do they develop a shadow pre-birth, or is it when they're not witnessed that the shadow starts to form?
That's an interesting question. I think some of it can form pre-birth. So to come back to the pregnancy where the mother isn't supported in having a baby or isn't sure about her relationship or something like that, the baby feels rejected, right? And scared probably, and they do their best to be accepted. So they might even stay really small so they don't cause a problem, or they become a really good baby and good child, maybe until they reach adolescence and then they start acting out like crazy. But they're getting the message that there's something wrong and that they're not accepted. And so I think that's a shadow that's already developing in the womb. Even if, so I'll just finish this, even if the mother decides later that she's really happy to have a child, the baby's still holding that.
Mm-hmm.
The mother could do repair and talk to the baby and say something like, "Well, I'm so sorry at that time that we found out about you being here. I just wasn't ready, but I'm so happy you're here now." That can do wonders.
So again, being seen, whether you're visibly present or just a bump in the tummy, being seen is huge, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
So what is the original embryonical potential?
So that's a term I came up with, original embryological potential. So the potential that we can see in the embryo. And the way I like to think about it is we start off at conception. When the sperm and the egg come together, we become a unicellular organism. It's called a zygote. And that unicellular organism develops into these complex bodies. That's incredible potential, right? We don't know how to do that. Scientists are still trying to understand this, really. They don't quite know how to do it. I hope they don't figure it out, because God knows what they do with it, but
We don't want to go there.
no, we don't want to go there. But embryos have incredible potential. And some of that potential is they can be incredibly resilient. They're very fluid. Our bodies are made up of, sometimes they say, 70% fluid, but a little embryo is closer to 100%. That's a lot of fluid. And fluid is flexible. As we get older, some of us are getting older, we tend to get stiffer. Our bodies rigidify. As we go through experience in life, our bodies get more rigid and more dense, and often our thinking goes with that, right? But if we can come back to our original fluid potential of the embryo, we can start to experience more flexibility, more resilience, and more creativity, which I find really helpful. So actually, one of the things I do is a practice called Continuum that was developed by my dear mentor, Emilie Conrad. And Continuum, Emilie would describe it as an inquiry into our fluid nature. And it takes us directly into this fluidic state where we experience often what I call our original embryological potential. So we tend to lose touch with that potential as we meet various conditions in life, but it's always there.
So what creates our potential? DNA, horoscope, past life? What all plays in there?
I love your questions. Well, I think you're asking about the mystery. And I don't know that I can give a definitive answer to that. I'm really informed by biodynamics, craniosacral biodynamics, in my understanding of that, where we sense different energetic layers and a sense of something we talk about, the breath of life. It's a mysterious source that is guiding our development as embryos and throughout life. And it seems to have a quality of stillness, but it's very alive. Like we talk about an alive and dynamic stillness. And we can sense that in our clients when we listen deeply and support their system in settling under all of the activations from their lives. And to me, that's part of our original potential also. In biodynamics, we talk about the health, and the original blueprint. So blueprint is the like a design an architect will create if you're going to build a building, and then the construction team hopefully follows the blueprint and creates what has been designed. It seems we have a design, and we're all shaped more or less the same way. Embryos, the first 3 weeks, all look the same. If they don't survive. That's our blueprint. And there's an intelligence and a health that's guiding that. It's mysterious.
So it sounds like I'm sorry. It sounds like it's a birth is like a three-way process. In other words, there's the spirit that incarnates, the one that sees what's going on before they actually come in, like my son was speaking,
Mhm.
and then there's what the father contributes and what the mother contributes.
Yeah.
So all of that plays in, doesn't it?
Yeah. And we talk about the sperm and the information coming from the sperm and the egg, from the parents, from ancestors, and then a third something, a being, a soul, a spirit, whatever you call it, spirit coming into form.
Man.
And when they meet, there seems to be an ignition, and poof, you have life.
It's a mystery for sure.
It
So
is.
how does the prenatal shadow relate to our original embryonical potential?
It's quite a mouthful. Sorry about that. So I think our potential, our original embryological potential, in short, let's say original embryo potential, can also be in shadow. So it also isn't acknowledged. We live in a world where, they don't print the good news, focuses on the bad news, right? Um, and the good news is we have this potential, but nobody talks about that. There are people in various healing fields that orient to that, but it's not something in our modern Western culture that we do. I think indigenous cultures traditionally would orient to that. But if we're not orienting to it and we're not acknowledging it, and things happen as we come into form, as we come into life, we're meeting various conditions and we have to accommodate or adjust to those, we can forget about our potential. It's still there, but it goes into shadow. So, people often think that it's the bad things that go into shadow. And that can be true, things that are believed to be bad. But you might ask, what's believed to be bad? And I like to give the example of like a pre-adolescent girl who's really smart and does really well in school. And then she hits adolescence and her peers become more important than her grades. And it's not cool to be smart, right? So she stops getting good grades. And at first it's intentional, she wants to be liked by her peers, but gradually she forgets that she's smart. And so her smartness, her intelligence goes into shadow, right? That's part of her potential.
So it sounds like potential and life purpose kind of can go hand in hand.
Mm. Mm. What can I say? I think you're right. I think, it's, I could speak for myself. I mean, it's certainly been my experience because I came in with a lot of trauma and I had a very um, dysfunctional family that I somehow survived. And after years and years and years of healing work, or through years of healing work, it's like I gradually came out,
Hmm.
and came into, I feel like I'm living my potential much more. I'm living my purpose.
Hmm.
And that was took step and gradually, step by step.
Well, we're going to have to take another commercial break. Please stay with us as Cherionna and I continue to explore prenatal and perinatal trauma. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. How does one heal prenatal wounding? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Cherionna Menzam-Sills. Her website, birthingyourlife.org. Cherionna, that's the question of the day. Okay, we found out, and you just mentioned before we went into the break how you worked through a lot of things to become to a point where you're living your potential. And so, how does a person start to work with the damage that they had prenatal and perinatal?
Hmm. Yeah, another really important question. And, the reason I do the work I do is to bring this out of shadow, to increase awareness. The first step in healing anything is awareness. If you're not aware of there being a problem, you won't try to deal with the problem. So, first of all, developing awareness. And, there are books to read, and there are things like this to come to. There are all kinds of uh, teachings available about it, not just from me, but to have curiosity and develop awareness as much as possible. Usually what happens with this material, in my experience, is as people begin to learn about it, their body and their emotions, this implicit memory is held in the body and in the emotions. And so that starts to resonate with it. And then they start to wonder what's going on. And they may have had that all along. And as soon as they hear about something like this, they go, oh, maybe they've been in therapy for 25 years and have gotten to a certain point, but there's still whatever problem there is. And then they come to this work and it goes to the root, because things start before we're born, usually. They start with the foundation. So, listening to what's arising in us in response to learning about this material can be really helpful. Just being curious about it and giving it space to express, and remembering that it's not verbal memory. So it's going to express in other ways. It could express through the body often. It can express through doing artwork, something like that. It's not likely to immediately express in words. People, maybe like your son, when they're 5 years old, they can talk about it. But gradually, I wouldn't be surprised if your son forgot, over time, unless, his mom is reminding him of it. Or, sometimes somebody, when they're really little, talk about one of those experiences, and then the parent innocently reminds them of it a few years later, and they go, I never said that. Shadow, So can be helpful just to be curious about it, about what may have happened, what might have been your experience. And actually, I'd love to tell a little story from my own experience about that.
Please.
I mentioned twin loss,
Mm-hmm.
and William Emerson used to talk a lot about that because he had lost a twin shortly after birth, and he saw it so often. And I was curious about it, but I didn't really have a sense of that for myself. I thought maybe, but I didn't know. And I was taking a trauma training, a pre and perinatal trauma training with him over a year, I think. And as part of it, a group of us who were local would meet every so often for a practice group. And the morning of one of these practice groups, I woke up with a dream where I saw half an egg yolk. I thought, well, that's interesting. And then I kind of forgot about it. And I went to the practice group. And at the beginning, we were all checking in, just how we were, what was up for us. And suddenly I remembered the dream, and I felt like I have to tell the group this dream. And as I was telling it, I just started sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. And I knew that represented my twin. There was only, half an egg.
Mm.
And I finally could feel the grief of it. I'd been kind of depressed all my life, but I didn't know that had anything to do with it. So then I could start to heal it, So dreams are also something to pay attention to. Yeah. So just being aware.
Because this is remembered by the body versus the mind, what are some of the body symptoms that we're starting to access this material?
Yeah. Well, I think earlier you had asked about birth trauma, so maybe I'll start with that. Is that it's really common for people to hold patterns in their body related to various forces that they experienced during birth. And so they might have like a C curve in their trunk. They're really common for chiropractors to say, oh, you have one leg shorter than the other. But often what it is that there's a curve in the trunk, and that can relate to certain stages of birth when there was pressure. If there's just pressure and no trauma, that won't be held. But if there's pressure and there's something going on at the same time, then that's going to be held in the body. Okay. People will also show in their face. For example, we start out in birth on, it's called the birth lie side. We're lying on one side. And if there are issues at the time when we're lying on the side, there can be compression on that side of the face that was against usually the mother's sacrum. So things like that can show up. There can be one shoulder higher than the other. But also, I mentioned discovery. So the time of discovery tends to be the time when the heart starts to beat, and which is around 22 days after conception. Amazingly, it's still beating. That's original embryological potential that our heart knows how to beat. So we tend to hold memories in an area that was actively developing at the time it happened. And so we tend to hold issues around discovery in the chest and heart area. And often people with that are caved in, or they might be puffed out. They might puff their chest out as a compensation, but often they're caved in like that. So you see things like that in people very commonly.
It's interesting reading body, like you read a body, their positioning, their posture, and that sort of thing, and it starts to unravel these mysteries. It sounds like. So, what does one need to overcome the trauma and embrace our potential?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, first of all, awareness and curiosity, and it can be really helpful to have support. So, to have a therapist who understands this material and has done enough of their own work that they're not just seeing their own history in you. Okay, so they know how to meet this material, because little ones are very relational and they are dependent on relationship for survival. So it's very helpful in the healing to have it happen within a safe relationship, a safe relational holding field, which can be a corrective experience, kind of like reparenting, what we didn't get or didn't get enough of or wasn't quite right earlier on. We can get from therapy. And we can
Basically,
get
if we weren't heard, the therapist can hear us, and that can be a correction.
exactly, we can get the reflection that we didn't get back then. And um, that might involve some normalizing. Well, of course, you felt bad about yourself after you were rejected,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean you are bad, right?
Right.
That's a normal reaction. That can be very reassuring.
So, how does the information regarding prenatal trauma and shadow aid in personal evolution?
Hmm. Well, that brings us back to our potential. So, if our potential is in shadow, we can't live it, right? If we shine the light on the shadow and do the healing around it, then who we're really meant to be can come forth. Yeah, and we can live our mission. And I also believe that, and there are many in the field of pre and perinatal psychology who believe this, that very early trauma in the womb or during birth, around that time, have such a profound effect on us and can result in things like angry politicians creating war. Okay. I won't go into all the politics going on right now, but I would love to see all the politicians in the world do this work. I think we'd have a very different world, you
We may
know.
not have any politicians after that,
Well,
right?
that may be true. I think part of our potential is to have peace and harmony and love. Love is a major aspect of what the embryo is capable of. When you look at them, they have a huge heart once it's developed. Huge. And, you know, they're very relational. So imagine if our world could function that way. So I see it as, you know, so important to bring this kind of trauma out of shadow so that we stop acting it out.
So, why do you see this information as vital during these pivotal times?
Well, we're kind of a mess in the world right now, aren't we? um, I think we're at a turning point in our world right now where we can either go more into separation and divisiveness and hatred and all of that, um, or we can go more into our potential of love.
It is a
And
turning point, isn't it?
it is. And I think,
Cherionna, we're about out of time, so I don't want to miss asking you, what's your mission?
um, well, my mission is what we're talking about, to shine the light on the shadow, to enhance awareness of this material so that we can live our full potential as individuals and as a world, as a planet.
More of us that live our potential, the better off the world's going to be, it sounds like to me.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Cherionna, thank you so, so much for all you do in the world and for bringing it to the show.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you. I
Been
love
real.
your questions. And thank you for doing your work.
Oh, thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Our guest this hour has been Cherionna Menzam-Sills, the author of The Breath of Life and Spirit into Form and The Prenatal Shadow, Healing the Traumas Experienced Before and at Birth. To find out more about Cherionna, where you can find her books and all she has to offer, visit her website, birthingyourlife.org. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit www.missionevolution.org. But most importantly, please be sure to join us right here again on the Voice of Canada Broadcast Network, vocbn.ca, where this mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.